Every warning Iran had issued in the preceding 4 weeks had been measured, carefully worded, and designed to communicate resolve without triggering the direct confrontation Tehran had spent years trying to avoid. The statements from the Foreign Ministry, the carefully calibrated speeches from Revolutionary Guard commanders, the back-channel communications relayed through Qatari and Omani intermediaries, all of it had been constructed to apply pressure without closing doors. Iran had watched Turkey move at Hormuz's northern approaches. It had watched Russia draw its red line over Syrian airspace. It had watched China deploy 8 warships to the straits, eastern entrance, and move global oil markets $7 a barrel in an afternoon without firing a single shot. And through all of it, Iran had held its most direct instrument of pressure in reserve, waiting for the moment when deploying it would carry the maximum strategic weight. On April 29, 2026, that moment arrived, and what Iran issued was not another calibrated diplomatic statement. It was a final warning, specific in its demands, precise in its timeline, and backed by a military posture that the Gulf states receiving it understood immediately was not constructed for show. If this is the kind of reporting you want, no spin, no shortcuts, the full picture, subscribe right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it keeps this work going. Because what Iran's final warning set in motion is a chain of the consequences that touches every oil-dependent economy on Earth, every military planner operating in the Gulf, every government that has spent the past 4 weeks hoping this conflict would exhaust itself before it reached the energy infrastructure that the global economy cannot function without. To understand the specific weight of what Iran did on April 29, you have to understand the position Tehran had been building toward for the entire duration of this conflict, because the final warning was not improvised. It was the last visible step in a sequence that had been running in parallel with every other development since March 28, mostly below the surface, in the movements of Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps naval units, in the positioning of ballistic missile batteries, in the activation of proxy networks across the Gulf that most Western intelligence services had been tracking with increasing alarm for 2 weeks before the warning was publicly issued. Iran's strategic position at the opening of Israel's Lebanon operation was one of significant indirect exposure. Hezbollah is not simply an Iranian ally. It is the product of 40 years of Iranian investment, financial, military, organizational, and ideological, and it functions as the forward deterrent component of Iran's security architecture against Israel. The logic had always been that any Israeli military action against Iran itself would face not only Iranian direct response, but simultaneous pressure from Hezbollah in the north and from other Iranian-aligned networks across the region. The Lebanon operation was, from Tehran's perspective, a direct assault on that architecture. Every Hezbollah position destroyed, every tunnel network degraded, every commander killed, was a reduction in Iran's own deterrent capacity against the threat it considers existential. Tehran had responded to that threat initially through the channels it controlled most directly, ensuring Hezbollah's command structure remained functional, working through the logistics networks that predated Israeli interdiction efforts, and maintaining the political and military coordination that kept Hezbollah fighting as an organized force rather than fragmenting under pressure. But as the operation entered its second month, as Turkish intervention and Russian positioning changed the international environment, and as Chinese pressure at Hormuz demonstrated what direct great power economic leverage looked like, Iran's leadership made a decision that had been building in the deliberations of the Supreme National Security Council for 2 weeks. If the outside powers most aligned with Iran's interests, Turkey, Russia, China, had each deployed their most significant available instrument of pressure, then Iran's continued restraint in deploying its own most significant instrument was no longer a strategic virtue. It was a strategic vacancy. It was leaving the most powerful tool Iran possessed unused at the moment when the weight of all these pressures was building toward a potential resolution and allowing that resolution to be shaped entirely by others without Iran's direct leverage in the equation. The final warning was delivered through three simultaneous channels on the morning of April 29th. The first channel was a formal diplomatic communication transmitted to the governments of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar through their respective ambassadors in Tehran. The second channel was a statement issued by the commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Navy, broadcast on Iranian state television and simultaneously released in English through Iran's official foreign affairs communication infrastructure. The third channel was a direct back-channel message to the American government through the Swiss protecting power in Tehran, which has historically served as the communications link between Washington and Tehran in the absence of formal diplomatic relations. The content of all three communications was consistent in its core demands and its timeline. Iran demanded an immediate and unconditional ceasefire in Lebanon within 72 hours. It demanded the immediate suspension of all American and European sanctions, deliberations targeting Iranian oil exports. It demanded the withdrawal of both American carrier strike groups from the eastern Mediterranean within 7 days, and it stated explicitly that failure to meet these demands within the specified timelines would result in Iran taking direct action to restrict navigation through the Strait of Hormuz using all available means, which the IRGC commander's public statement clarified to include naval mining operations, anti-ship missile deployments, and the activation of fast boat interdiction capabilities that Iranian forces had been rehearsing in Gulf exercises for years. The specific mention of naval mining was the element that landed hardest in every naval command and every maritime insurance market that received the statement. Mines are not a precise weapon. They do not discriminate between the nationalities of the ships that trigger them. A mining operation in the Strait of Hormuz does not just threaten Israeli-linked shipping or American naval vessels. It threatens every supertanker from every nation that transits the strait, which is to say it threatens the energy supply of Japan, South Korea, India, China, and every European economy that still draws Gulf crude. The threat of mining is the most economically indiscriminate form of military pressure available in a maritime choke point environment, and Iran had used it before in the tanker war of the 1980s, with consequences that the insurance industry and the naval community had not forgotten. Within 2 hours of the Iranian statement becoming public, oil markets moved in a way that made China's Hormuz deployment 4 days earlier look moderate by comparison. Brent crude rose $14 a barrel in the first hour of trading after the announcement. LNG spot prices moved to their highest recorded level. The Baltic Exchange Dirty Tanker Index, which measures the cost of chartering oil tankers, spiked in a single session to levels that effectively made Hormuz transits economically prohibitive for smaller shipping operators. 7 major shipping companies issued immediate notices suspending Gulf bookings pending security assessment. 2 Japanese energy firms declared force majeure on LNG delivery contracts. The Indian government convened an emergency cabinet meeting within 4 hours of the Iranian statement to assess the country's strategic petroleum reserve position and the viability of alternative supply routes. All of this economic dislocation occurred before Iran had taken a single military action. The threat alone, credible and precisely worded and backed by a visible military posture, was sufficient to begin producing the economic consequences Iran intended to use as leverage. This is the specific form of power Iran was exercising. Not the power to destroy, but the power to make the global economy afraid of what destruction might look like, and to sustain that fear long enough to extract a political concession. The Gulf states receiving Iran's diplomatic communication were in a position that no amount of careful hedging and equidistance management had prepared them for. Saudi Arabia had spent 3 years diversifying its security relationships, cultivating China, normalizing its relationship with Iran through the Beijing brokered agreement of 2023, maintaining its American security partnerships while signaling that Riyadh would no longer subordinate its interests entirely to Washington's preferences. That diversification strategy had been designed for a world where the pressures were sequential and manageable. It had not been designed for a world where Iran was simultaneously their neighbor, their direct security threat, and the power issuing demands backed by the credible capability to shut down the export infrastructure that funded everything the Saudi state had promised its population. Riyadh's response to the Iranian communication was the most consequential single governmental reaction of the 48 hours that followed, because Saudi Arabia's position determined what the Gulf Cooperation Council could say and do collectively. The kingdom issued a public statement calling for all parties to exercise restraint, reaffirming the importance of freedom of navigation in international waters, and expressing support for diplomatic resolution of the Lebanon crisis. What the statement conspicuously did not do was characterize Iran's warning as a violation of international norms, call for international condemnation of the mining threat, or invoke the mutual defense mechanisms of the GCC framework. In diplomatic language, the absence of those elements is as meaningful as any words the statement contained. Saudi Arabia was signaling that it would not position itself publicly against Iran at this moment, even as it was almost certainly communicating something more direct through private channels. The UAE's response was even more carefully calibrated. Abu Dhabi issued no public statement for the first 12 hours and then released a one-paragraph expression of support for diplomatic solutions and navigational freedom that was so thoroughly stripped of any directional content that it served primarily as a signal that the Emirates had no intention of being the party that publicly called out Iran while living within ballistic missile range of Iranian territory and IRGC naval assets. Kuwait and Bahrain, both of which host significant American military infrastructure, found themselves in the acutest position of all the Gulf states. Bahrain is home to the United States Fifth Fleet headquarters. Kuwait hosts American military logistics and air assets. Both countries are small enough and close enough to Iranian territory that their security is, in the most literal physical sense, dependent on the choices larger powers make. Neither government issued a public statement that went beyond generalized calls for calm. What both governments were doing in private was calling Washington with a message that can be summarized as, resolve this before Iran makes it a choice between American military protection and Iranian geographic reality, because we cannot survive being the answer to that question. Qatar's situation was structurally different from its GCC partners in ways that gave Doha a specific and urgent role. The North Field, which Qatar shares with Iran and which produces the LNG that makes Qatar one of the wealthiest countries per capita on Earth, is located in the Persian Gulf. Any military action in the Gulf, including mining operations that Iran was now threatening, would put Qatar's primary export infrastructure at risk regardless of Doha's political positioning, and Qatar was simultaneously the country running the ceasefire mediation channel between Israel and the parties in Lebanon, a channel that had gained authorization from the Israeli War Cabinet just 3 days earlier. Tehran's 72-hour deadline was, in significant part, a pressure instrument aimed at accelerating that mediation. Qatar understood this better than anyone, which is why Doha's foreign minister was on a plane to multiple capitals within hours. Coding of the Iranian statement becoming public, carrying a message that the mediation needed to produce visible progress within the 72-hour window or the consequences would extend well beyond Lebanon. In Washington, the Iranian warning produced a crisis management tempo that had not been seen since the earliest hours of the Lebanon operation itself. The National Security Council met in continuous session. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs was in direct communication with Fifth Fleet and with Central Command. The Treasury Department was assessing what sanctions suspension would require legally and politically, and what the domestic Congressional reaction to such a suspension would be the State Department was managing simultaneous urgent communications with every Gulf partner, with Israel, with Qatar on the mediation timeline, with European allies whose own energy security was now directly implicated, and through the Swiss Channel with Tehran itself. The American response was constrained by a structural problem that no amount of crisis management skill could fully resolve. The United States had committed publicly and repeatedly to Israel's right to self-defense and to its opposition to any external coercion aimed at forcing a ceasefire on terms that did not meet Israel's security requirements. It had also committed publicly to freedom of navigation in the Gulf and to the protection of global energy infrastructure. Iran's final warning had been constructed precisely to put those two commitments into direct conflict with each other. Meeting Iran's demand for a ceasefire timeline meant applying pressure on Israel to accept terms it had not agreed to. Refusing Iran's demands meant accepting the economic consequences of a Hormuz disruption that would be felt immediately and painfully by every American ally in Asia and Europe and by American consumers through energy prices. The response the White House ultimately constructed was a two-track approach. Publicly, the United States condemned the threat to freedom of navigation in the strongest terms, announced additional naval assets moving toward the Gulf region to reinforce the Fifth Fleet posture, and reaffirmed its commitment to keeping Hormuz open. Privately, through the Swiss Channel, American negotiators communicated to Tehran that the United States was prepared to engage seriously on the sanctions question if Iran demonstrated genuine movement toward a ceasefire framework in Lebanon, essentially acknowledging that Iran's demands had created a linkage that Washington would not publicly validate but could not operationally ignore. That private acknowledgement was itself a significant concession, even if its significance was hidden behind public language that said something different. Iran had demanded that the world's most powerful military and economic actor engage with its demands on a timeline Tehran had set, and within 24 hours of issuing the demand, the United States was engaging. Not publicly, not on terms Tehran had fully dictated, but engaging. The leverage had worked at least partially, at least in the short term, which meant that the 72-hour clock was now the central organizing fact of every diplomatic conversation happening simultaneously in Doha, Washington, Jerusalem, Riyadh, and Beijing. For Israel, the convergence of Iran's ultimatum with the existing Turkish, Russian, and Chinese pressures created a political environment in which the War Cabinet's decision 4 days earlier to authorize exploratory ceasefire discussions had moved from a cautious hedge to an urgent operational priority. The question was no longer whether Israel would engage with a ceasefire framework, but what terms it could secure within a timeline set by an adversary and enforced by the economic consequences that were already registering in global markets. The Israeli military command's assessment of the ground situation in southern Lebanon, presented to the War Cabinet on the morning of April 30th, was direct and unsparing. After 33 days of operations, Israeli forces held a continuous line of positions between 5 and 12 kilometers inside Lebanese territory, across most of the invasion front. Significant Hezbollah infrastructure had been destroyed. Weapons, depots, command facilities, rocket launch sites. The casualty toll inflicted on Hezbollah was real and substantial, but the tunnel network remained partially functional. Hezbollah's command structure had not been decapitated. The force estimates at the beginning of the operation had proven wrong by a factor of 3, and the resupply route Turkey had opened meant that Hezbollah's ammunition situation, while strained, was not the critical vulnerability Israeli planners had hoped it would be by this point in the campaign. The assessment concluded that achieving the original objectives, the complete dismantling of Hezbollah's military infrastructure in the designated security zone, would require an estimated additional 6 to 10 weeks of operations at current intensity, producing an estimated additional casualty toll that the document quantified with a specificity that made the room very quiet when the number was read aloud. That assessment, combined with the 72-hour Iranian ultimatum and the economic consequences already visible in global markets, was the context in which the most consequential diplomatic phone call of the entire crisis took place on the tour's evening of April 30th. The call was between the American president and the Israeli prime minister. It lasted 47 minutes. No readout was immediately issued. What was communicated in that call has not been fully confirmed by official sources, but its effects became visible within 12 hours in the form of an acceleration of the Qatar-mediated ceasefire discussions and a shift in the Israeli negotiating position on several parameters that had previously been characterized as non-negotiable. Iran's 72-hour clock was running. The diplomatic machinery was moving faster than it had moved at any point in the preceding 5 weeks. Markets remained elevated, shipping remained disrupted, and Gulf states remained in the posture of public leash, calling for calm while privately demanding resolution through every channel available to them. The mining threat had not been executed. The 72 hours had not yet expired. But the geometry of the crisis had shifted in a way that reflected something important about how Iran had constructed its intervention and what it had achieved. Every outside power that had entered this conflict, Turkey, Russia, China, and now Iran, directly had done so using the instrument best suited to its specific form of leverage. At the moment best suited to maximizing that leverage's impact, Turkey had used NATO membership and geographic proximity to open a logistics route. Russia had used its Syrian military presence and its deconfliction relationship with Israel to constrain air operations. China had used its naval modernization and Gulf economic relationships to move global energy markets with warships alone. Iran had used its geographic control of the world's most critical energy choke point and its credible history of using that geography as a weapon to create a deadline that organized every other diplomatic conversation around its timeline. None of these interventions, individually, had been enough to force a resolution. Together, they had created an environment so comprehensively constrained that the original objectives of the operation that had started it all, the clean, fast dismantlement of Hezbollah's military infrastructure in 3 to 5 days, now existed only as a reference point for understanding how far the situation had traveled from where it began. The gap between the plan and the reality, which had first appeared in the intelligence assessments that underestimated Hezbollah's strength by a factor of 3, and in the tunnel networks that ran deeper than any pre-invasion mapping had widened across 5 weeks into a chasm that encompassed the navies of 3 great powers, the air defense architecture of a 4th, the energy security of every oil-dependent economy on Earth, and the 72-hour ultimatum of the country that controls the physical passage through which 20% of the world's oil supply moves every day. The soldiers still in their positions in southern Lebanon were still there. The families were still waiting. The medics were still working in buildings that were not fully standing. None of the great power repositioning, none of the market movements, none of the diplomatic phone calls had changed the immediate physical reality for the people bearing the direct cost of what had been set in motion on March 28th. What it had changed was the world above them, the world of decisions and consequences and leverage and fear, and changed it in ways that would shape not just how this conflict ended, but how the next one began, and the one after that. And every negotiation and ultimatum and red line and deployment that would occur in this region for a generation to come. What do you think? Does Iran's final warning represent the turning point that forces a genuine ceasefire, or has Tehran overplayed its hand in a way that ultimately invites a military response that reshapes the entire regional balance? Drop your answer in the comments below. Every comment this video gets pushes it to more people who need to see this story told straight. And if this is the kind of reporting you want, complete, independent, no shortcuts, no spin, subscribe. This channel covers what the mainstream skips. It is fully independent, and the support link is below. Every contribution goes directly into keeping this work going.